Jake Thornton had opened the barn door expecting nothing more than dust and decay, but the albino colt staring back at him with unearthly blue eyes changed everything. 13 horses shouldn't have survived 6 months locked in an abandoned barn, and the men who killed their owner were coming back to finish what they started. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jake Thornton had been riding the Montana high country for 3 days when he spotted the abandoned farmstead tucked into a valley that time seemed to have forgotten. The late afternoon sun painted the weathered buildings in shades of amber and rust, and something about the place called to him with a pull he couldn't quite explain. At 42 years old, Jake had learned to trust his instincts, even when they led him down paths that made no logical sense. Those instincts had kept him alive through 2 tours in Afghanistan, through the collapse of his marriage, and through 5 years of drifting from ranch to ranch, never quite finding a place that felt like home. His gelding, a sturdy buckskin named Ranger, picked his way down the rocky slope toward the farm with the careful precision of a horse who knew his rider's life depended on his sure-footedness. Jake could see from this distance that the property had been deserted for some time. The main house listed slightly to one side, its porch sagging under the weight of neglect. The fences had fallen in places, creating gaps where livestock had probably wandered off or been stolen. But it was the barn that drew his attention. A massive red structure that somehow remained proud and defiant despite the years of abandonment. As he drew closer, Jake noticed details that suggested this hadn't been just any farm. The barn was built with craftsmanship that spoke of wealth and care, its timbers hewn from old-growth timber that would have cost a fortune even back when it was constructed. The paddocks, though overgrown with prairie grass and wildflowers, had been laid out with an understanding of horse behavior that only came from genuine expertise. This had been a breeding operation once, and a significant one at that. The thought stirred something in Jake's chest, a longing for the life he'd left behind when he'd signed up to serve his country, before everything had fallen apart. He dismounted near the barn, his boots crunching on gravel that was slowly being reclaimed by the earth. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the tall grass and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Ranger snorted softly, his ears swiveling forward toward the barn with an intensity that made Jake's hand instinctively move to the rifle secured to his saddle. In country like this, you never knew what might have taken up residence in abandoned buildings. Bears, cougars, even desperate men on the run from the law, all had been known to claim empty structures as their own. But there was something else in the air, a presence that felt almost expectant, as if the farm itself had been waiting for someone to arrive. Jake had spent enough time alone in the wilderness to recognize the difference between the emptiness of true abandonment and the watchful quiet of a place that still held life. He approached the barn slowly, his weathered hands hanging loose at his sides, ready but not aggressive. Years of working with horses had taught him that approaching anything with tension was a sure way to create trouble where none needed to exist. The barn doors were massive things, built to withstand Montana winters that could bury a man in snow and winds that felt like they came straight from the Arctic. One door hung slightly ajar, creating a gap just wide enough for Jake to peer through if he wanted. But something made him hesitate, that same instinct that had pulled him down from the high country now whispering a warning he couldn't quite interpret. His heart was beating faster than it should have been for a man simply exploring an empty building, and his mouth had gone dry with an anticipation he didn't understand. Ranger nickered behind him, a sound that held encouragement and concern in equal measure. The horse had been with Jake through more miles and more hardship than most humans would ever experience, and Jake had learned to read his companion's moods as easily as other men read the morning newspaper. Right now, Ranger was curious but not alarmed, interested but not afraid. Whatever waited inside that barn, it wasn't something that threatened immediate danger. Jake placed his hand on the rough wood of the door, feeling the grain beneath his palm, worn smooth in places where countless other hands had pushed it open over the decades. The metal hinges were rusted but still solid, testament to the quality of construction that had gone into this place. He thought about the people who had built this barn, who had worked here, who had raised horses in these paddocks. What had driven them away? Economic collapse, family tragedy, the simple grinding weight of trying to make a living in country that gave nothing without extracting a heavy price in return. The door resisted at first, its weight and the accumulated rust of years making it reluctant to move. But Jake was a strong man, his shoulders and arms corded with muscle earned through decades of physical labor, and he put his weight into the effort. The door groaned like a living thing waking from a long sleep, the sound echoing across the empty valley. As the gap widened, light spilled into the barn's interior, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden rays like tiny spirits celebrating their liberation from darkness. What Jake saw in that first moment froze him in place, his hand still gripping the door, his breath catching in his throat with an audible gasp. The barn wasn't empty, not even close. And what stood there regarding him with eyes that held an intelligence that seemed almost human would change everything he thought he knew about loyalty, about second chances, and about the mysterious ways that fate could reach out and redirect a man's life when he least expected it. His hand moved unconsciously to his mouth, covering it in a gesture of pure shock as his mind struggled to process what his eyes were telling him. The albino colt stood in the center of the barn like a ghost made flesh, its coat so purely white that it seemed to glow in the dim light, filtering through the gaps in the walls. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, pressing close in the shadows, stood at least a dozen other horses, their darker coats making them nearly invisible in the barn's interior until Jake's eyes adjusted to the contrast. The colt itself couldn't have been more than 6 months old, all gangly legs and oversized ears with pink skin showing through its white coat and eyes that glowed an eerie pale blue in the half-light. It was the most unusual horse Jake had ever seen, and he'd seen plenty in his years working ranches across 3 states. The animals watched him with an intensity that was almost unnerving. None of them showed signs of panic or aggression, but neither did they display the skittish nervousness he would have expected from horses that had been living wild in an abandoned barn. They simply stood there, observing him with what seemed like collective patience, as if they'd been waiting for someone to open that door and had finally been rewarded for their vigil. The albino colt took a single step forward, its small hooves clicking against the wooden floor with surprising confidence for such a young animal. Jake's mind raced through possibilities, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Horses didn't just survive on their own in abandoned buildings, especially not this many of them, and especially not with a colt this young in their midst. Someone had to be caring for them, feeding them, providing water. But as his eyes swept the barn's interior, taking in the dusty feed troughs and the cobwebs that draped from every corner like funeral decorations, he saw no evidence of recent human presence. The hay in the loft above looked ancient and unusable, compressed into dark blocks by years of settling. The water troughs were dry, their bottoms cracked and stained. Yet the horses looked healthy, not just surviving, but actually thriving. Their coats, though dusty, held a sheen that spoke of adequate nutrition. Their eyes were bright and clear, showing none of the dullness that came from starvation or disease. The colt's ribs weren't showing, and its legs, though still carrying the knobby-kneed awkwardness of youth, appeared strong and well-formed. This shouldn't have been possible. Horses needed consistent food and water to maintain condition like this, and there was no way these animals were getting either from their surroundings. Jake took a cautious step into the barn, moving slowly to avoid spooking the herd. His boots stirred up dust that had probably been settling undisturbed for months, maybe years. The albino colt's ears swiveled toward him, tracking his movement with alert interest but no fear. Behind it, the other horses shifted slightly, creating a soft symphony of movement that echoed through the cavernous space. He could make out more details now, seeing that the herd consisted of mares and younger horses, no stallion that he could detect. That explained the lack of aggressive behavior, but it raised even more questions about how they'd survived and why they were here. The colt took another step toward him, then another, moving with a boldness that seemed almost unnatural for a young horse encountering a human for what might be the first time in its short life. Jake held perfectly still, letting the animal approach on its own terms, following the rules he'd learned from his grandfather, back when he was barely tall enough to reach a horse's shoulder. Never chase, never grab, never force. Let them come to you, and you'll earn trust that force could never buy. When the colt was close enough that Jake could have reached out and touched it, the young horse stopped and regarded him with those strange pale blue eyes. Up close, Jake could see that the animal's coat wasn't purely white, but held subtle variations in shade, like cream swirled through milk. Its mane and tail were slightly darker, closer to ivory than snow, and its pink skin gave its entire body an almost translucent quality in the dim light. The effect was both beautiful and slightly unsettling, as if the colt existed in some realm between the solid world and something more ethereal. Jake slowly extended his hand, palm down, fingers relaxed, giving the colt a chance to catch his scent and make its own decision about whether to accept contact. The young horse stretched its neck forward, nostrils flaring as it processed the information carried on Jake's skin. Hot breath washed over his hand, and then, with a gentleness that surprised him, the colt pressed its velvety muzzle against his palm. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through Jake's chest, a connection that felt almost electric in its intensity. Behind the colt, the other horses had begun to move forward as well, emboldened by their young companion's acceptance of this stranger. They emerged from the shadows like spirits materializing from mist, revealing themselves to be a collection of bays and chestnuts, and one striking buckskin mare who might have been Ranger's twin. None showed the aggressive hierarchy behavior that typically governed horse herds. Instead, they moved with a unity of purpose that suggested they'd formed bonds stronger than the usual pecking order, united by circumstance into something more like a family than a random collection of animals. Jake's throat tightened with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. There was something profoundly moving about these horses and their survival against odds that should have been insurmountable. They reminded him of himself in ways he didn't want to examine too closely. Creatures who had been abandoned by whatever circumstances had brought them here, yet who had somehow found a way to endure. The albino colt leaned into his hand, seeking more contact, and Jake obliged by moving his palm to the animal's neck, feeling the warmth of living flesh beneath the unusual coat. The practical side of Jake's mind, the part that had kept him alive through combat and kept him employed through years of wandering, began asserting itself over his wonder. These horses needed water immediately, and they needed feed if they were going to maintain their mysteriously good condition. He reluctantly stepped back from the colt, earning a small nicker of protest that tugged at something deep in his chest. The sound was so trusting, so innocent, that it made him want to promise this strange young creature that he wouldn't abandon it the way others clearly had. He moved deeper into the barn, his eyes adjusting fully to the dim interior as he searched for clues about how these animals had survived. The feed room door hung open on broken hinges, revealing empty sacks and scattered grain that mice had long since claimed. The tack room was similarly bare, leather goods either stolen or rotted away to nothing. But when he climbed the ladder to the loft, he found something that stopped him cold. Fresh hay, not ancient and compressed, but relatively new, maybe 3 months old at most. Someone had been here, had left supplies for these horses, and judging by the amount remaining, they'd planned for an extended absence. Jake descended the ladder with his mind churning through implications. This wasn't abandonment in the traditional sense. Someone was caring for these horses, at least intermittently. But why leave them locked in a barn instead of in pastures where they could graze naturally? Why the secrecy, The isolation. He thought about the albino colt's unusual appearance, about the quality of the other horses he could now see more clearly in the improving light. These weren't random ranch horses. They were well-bred animals, probably worth significant money to the right buyers. The sound of a vehicle approaching shattered the barn's peaceful silence. Jake moved quickly to the door, his hand instinctively checking the knife he wore on his belt, a habit from years when being unarmed could mean being dead. Through the gap, he watched as a battered pickup truck wound its way down the overgrown drive, moving slowly as if the driver was being cautious. The truck pulled to a stop near the house, and an elderly man climbed out with the careful movements of someone whose body had been used hard and was now protesting every demand made upon it. The man was probably in his 70s, weathered by sun and wind until his face resembled old leather. He wore faded jeans and a work shirt that had seen better decades, and his boots were held together more by hope than by what remained of their original stitching. But it was his eyes that caught Jake's attention when the old man spotted him standing in the barn doorway. Those eyes held a mixture of relief and wariness, hope and fear, all swirling together in a way that spoke of desperation barely held in check. They regarded each other across 30 feet of weed-choked yard, two men measuring the threat level of an unexpected encounter. The old man broke the silence first, his voice rough as gravel, but steady. I wondered when someone would finally come poking around. Figured it was only a matter of time before curiosity got the better of some drifter passing through. Jake kept his hands visible and relaxed. Name's Jake Thornton. I was riding through and saw the place. Didn't mean to trespass, but I found your horses and thought they might need tending. The old man's expression softened slightly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. They ain't exactly my horses, not anymore, but I've been looking after them best I can since everything went to hell. He moved closer, his gait uneven from what looked like an old injury that had never healed properly. Name's Walter Hayes. I used to work this place back when it was something worth working. Jake stepped aside to let Walter peer into the barn, watching the old man's face transform as he took in the sight of the horses. There was love there, pure and uncomplicated, the kind of devotion that a man might show for his children or the memory of a woman who'd meant the world to him. Walter's hand trembled slightly as he reached toward the albino colt, who had followed Jake to the door and now pressed forward to greet this familiar presence. "Beautiful, ain't he?" Walter said softly, his fingers gentle on the colt's white face. "Born here 6 months ago, right in that very stall where his mama still stands. Purest white colt I ever saw in 40 years of breeding horses, and that's saying something because we bred some of the finest in 3 states back when this place was running proper." Jake filed away the information, the pieces of a larger story beginning to take shape in his mind. What happened here? Why are these horses locked in a barn instead of out on pasture? Walter's face clouded over, aging another decade in the space of a heartbeat. That's a long story and not a pleasant one. The short version is that the man who owned this place, Thomas Merrick, got himself deep in debt to some people who don't take kindly to not getting paid. When he couldn't come up with the money, they came for the horses, planned to sell them off to whoever would pay. No questions asked about whether they'd be treated right or worked to death or worse. The old man's voice grew rough with emotion. Thomas, he knew what was coming, and he loved these horses like they were his own children. On the night before the creditors were supposed to arrive, he loaded every horse on the property into this barn and told me to keep them here, keep them safe no matter what. Then he took off, said he was going to lead those debt collectors on a wild chase while I figured out what to do with the animals. "And what happened to Thomas?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Walter's silence was answer enough. After a long moment, the old man spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "They found him 3 weeks later in a ravine about 50 miles north. Official report said he lost control of his truck on a mountain road. Unofficial truth is that Thomas Merrick was one of the best drivers in the county and knew those roads like the back of his hand. He didn't lose control of anything. He was murdered, plain and simple, and the law couldn't prove it enough to matter. The words settled over them like a shroud, heavy with implications and unspoken threats. Jake looked back at the albino colt, understanding now why the animal's survival felt so precious, so improbable. This wasn't just a young horse, it was a living testament to a man's love and sacrifice, a creature whose very existence was an act of defiance against those who valued profit over life. Walter led Jake into the barn properly, his movements careful among the horses who clearly knew and trusted him. The afternoon light slanting through the gaps in the walls created bars of gold that striped across the animals' bodies, turning them into living works of art. The old man's hands moved constantly as he spoke, checking each horse with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the subtle signs of equine health and distress. He ran his fingers along flanks and down legs, examining hooves and checking eyes with the gentle thoroughness of a man who genuinely cared about these creatures. The creditors, Walter continued, they put a lien on the property, but they never actually took possession. Legal wrangling, something about Thomas's will and some distant relatives who might have a claim. Been 6 months now, and the whole thing's stuck in courts that move slower than winter molasses. Meanwhile, I've been sneaking out here every few days with feed and water, keeping these horses alive and hidden because the moment anyone official knows they're here, they'll be seized and sold to cover debts that weren't their fault to begin with. Jake watched the albino colt move among the other horses, noting how they all seemed to defer to the young animal despite its age. There was something about the colt that commanded attention, a presence that went beyond its unusual coloring. The way it moved suggested confidence that hadn't yet been tempered by experience, a boldness that made Jake think of young soldiers who hadn't yet learned to be afraid. It reminded him uncomfortably of himself at 18, convinced of his own invincibility right up until the moment when combat taught him otherwise. "How have you been managing this on your own?" Jake asked, genuinely curious about the logistics of caring for this many horses in secret. "Feed costs alone must be crippling your finances." Walter's laugh was bitter and tired. "I've been selling off everything I own that ain't nailed down and some things that were. My own horses went first, then equipment, then personal belongings that my late wife would probably rise from her grave to scold me for parting with. But what else am I supposed to do? Thomas trusted me with these animals. His last words to me were, 'Keep them safe, Walter, no matter what it costs.' A man doesn't break that kind of promise, not if he wants to be able to look at himself in the mirror." The simple nobility of Walter's dedication struck Jake hard. Here was a man who was bankrupting himself to honor a dead friend's wishes, asking nothing in return except the satisfaction of knowing he'd kept his word. In Jake's experience, that kind of loyalty was rarer than the albino colt standing before them. Most people talked a good game about honor and commitment, but when the bills came due and the personal cost got high, their principles developed a tendency to become remarkably flexible. "What happens when you run out of things to sell?" Jake asked quietly. "What happens when you can't afford to feed them anymore?" Walter's silence was heavy with implications he didn't want to voice. Finally, he spoke, his words coming slow and painful. "I've been trying not to think about that day. Been hoping maybe the legal situation would resolve itself. Or maybe I'd find someone who could help. Someone with resources and a good heart, who might see what I see when I look at these horses. Someone who'd understand that some things are worth fighting for even when the odds are stacked against you." The words hung in the air between them, and Jake felt their weight settling on his shoulders like a mantle he hadn't asked for, but couldn't quite bring himself to shrug off. He'd come to Montana looking for work, for a place to spend the winter before moving on come spring. He'd been planning to drift through as he drifted through everywhere else for the past 5 years, never putting down roots, never letting anyone or anything matter enough to hurt him when he eventually left. That's what he'd told himself anyway. That's what he'd believed right up until he opened that barn door and saw a white colt that looked at him like he mattered. "I don't have the kind of money you'd need to keep this operation going," Jake said, hating the way Walter's expression dimmed at his words. "But I've got time, and I've got skills. Worked as a horse trainer before I enlisted, and I've picked up ranch work all across the West since I got out. If you need help keeping these horses hidden and healthy, I can give you that much at least." Walter's face transformed, years seeming to drop away as hope replaced resignation. "You mean that? You'd stay here, risk getting caught up in whatever trouble follows these horses around, just to help an old man you met 10 minutes ago keep a promise to a dead friend?" Jake thought about the question, about all the reasons he should say no and walk away from complications he didn't need. But when he looked at the albino colt, when he met those strange pale blue eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense he'd built around himself, he found he couldn't form the words that would let him leave. "Yes," he said simply. "I mean it." They shook hands on it, their grips firm despite the vast difference in their ages and the complete absence of any written agreement or formal arrangement. This was the kind of deal men made in country where a handshake still meant something, where your word was the measure of your worth, and breaking it marked you as someone not fit to associate with decent folk. Jake had thought he'd left this kind of simple trust behind when he'd gone to war and seen what men were capable of doing to each other, but standing in that barn with Walter Hayes and a herd of horses who shouldn't have survived, he found himself wanting to believe in it again. The practical work began immediately. Walter showed Jake where he'd been storing feed in a hidden cache a quarter mile from the barn, bags of grain covered with tarps and branches to keep them dry and concealed. They hauled water from the creek that ran behind the property, filling troughs while the horses drank with the desperate enthusiasm of animals who never took water for granted. The albino colt stayed close to Jake throughout these tasks, following him like a large dog, occasionally bumping against his legs with that bold curiosity that seemed to define its personality. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and purple that made the whole valley look like something from a dream, Walter shared more of the story behind the farm and its owner. Thomas Merrick had inherited the property from his father, who'd built it into one of the premier horse breeding operations in Montana during the 70s and 80s. They'd specialized in quarter horses with bloodlines that traced back to the foundation sires, animals that combined speed with intelligence and the kind of calm temperament that made them ideal for both ranch work and competition. But Thomas had a vision that went beyond simply maintaining what his father had built. He wanted to create something unique, a breeding program that would produce horses of exceptional quality and unusual characteristics. The albino colt was the culmination of years of careful genetic planning, Walter explained, the product of bloodlines that Thomas had been developing for over a decade. The white coat wasn't just a random mutation. It was the result of selecting for specific traits across multiple generations, combined with luck and timing that couldn't be replicated if you tried. The problem was that excellence required money, and Thomas had poured everything he had into his breeding program. When the economy collapsed and the market for expensive horses dried up overnight, he found himself holding assets that were valuable on paper, but impossible to convert to cash quickly enough to satisfy creditors who wanted their money immediately. He'd borrowed heavily to purchase a particular mare whose bloodlines complemented his program perfectly, and when he couldn't make the payments, the debt collectors had come calling with threats that quickly escalated beyond mere legal action. Jake listened to the story while working, his hands busy with tasks that felt familiar and right in ways that surprised him. He'd forgotten how much he enjoyed the simple rhythm of barn work, the satisfaction of caring for animals who depended on him completely, The horses responded to his presence with a trust that felt unearned but precious, and the albino colt in particular seemed to have decided that Jake was worth following everywhere. The young horse's constant attention was simultaneously endearing and unnerving, as if the animal could sense something in Jake that he wasn't ready to acknowledge in himself. "You said the colt was born here 6 months ago," Jake said as they finished distributing hay to the horses. "That means his mother is one of these mares." "Which one?" Walter gestured toward the back of the barn where a beautiful bay mare stood slightly apart from the others. "That's Snowdrift, though the name's more ironic now than it was when Thomas picked it. She's the mare he went into debt to acquire, and as it turns out, she was worth every penny he paid. The colt's got her intelligence and his father's speed, plus that unusual coloring that makes him one of a kind." Jake approached Snowdrift slowly, reading her body language for signs of protective aggression that mares sometimes showed when strangers came near their offspring. But the mare seemed remarkably calm, even friendly, as he extended his hand for her to sniff. Her coat was a deep, rich brown that gleamed even in the barn's dim light, and her conformation suggested both power and grace. She was the kind of horse that Jake's grandfather would have called a foundation animal, the type you built an entire breeding program around because every foal she produced would carry her exceptional qualities. The albino colt pushed between Jake and his mother, apparently jealous of the attention being directed elsewhere. Jake couldn't help but smile at the young horse's possessiveness, recognizing in the behavior something almost childlike in its transparency. "You're going to be trouble, aren't you?" he murmured, scratching behind the colt's ears in a spot that made the young animal's eyes half close with pleasure. Walter chuckled, the sound rough but genuine. "He's already trouble, smart as a whip and twice as bold. Thomas used to say that Colt had the heart of a lion and the brains of a chess master. Said he'd either become the greatest horse he ever bred or die young doing something stupid because he didn't know enough to be afraid." The words sent a chill through Jake that he tried to ignore. He'd heard similar things said about young soldiers, about men who charged into danger with more courage than sense. He'd said similar things himself, back before he'd learned that bravery and stupidity often looked identical until the bullets started flying and you found out which one you'd been displaying. The albino colt pushed harder against his hand, demanding more attention, and Jake obliged, because refusing seemed somehow cruel. As darkness settled over the valley, Walter prepared to leave, his movements reluctant despite the late hour. "I've got to get back before my daughter starts calling around looking for me," he said, though his eyes kept drifting back to the horses as if he was afraid this might be the last time he'd see them. "She thinks I'm spending too much time and money on this lost cause, and maybe she's right. But I can't seem to help myself." Jake walked the old man to his truck, the albino colt trailing along behind them like a pale ghost in the gathering darkness. The young horse's unusual coloring made it stand out even more at night, seeming to catch and reflect what little light remained in the sky. Walter noticed the colt's devotion and smiled. "Looks like you've made a friend. That one doesn't take to just anyone." Thomas used to say the colt could read people, could tell good from bad with just a look. "Animals don't work that way," Jake replied, uncomfortable with the implication that he'd somehow passed some kind of test. "They respond to how you treat them, not to some mystical evaluation of your character." Walter's expression suggested he disagreed but wasn't interested in arguing the point. "You'll be here tomorrow?" he asked instead. "I can bring more feed and we can work out a proper schedule for caring for them." "I'll be here," Jake confirmed, surprising himself with how readily the promise came. He'd spent 5 years avoiding commitments that lasted longer than a season, but something about this situation felt different. Maybe it was the horses themselves, or maybe it was the simple fact that someone needed help, and he was capable of providing it. Either way, he found himself wanting to stay, at least for a while. After Walter drove away, Jake stood in the yard watching the stars emerge one by one across the vast Montana sky. The first night Jake spent at the abandoned farm was one of the longest of his life, and he'd endured plenty of long nights in places far more dangerous than a remote Montana valley. He'd made camp in the farmhouse rather than the barn, reasoning that if anyone came looking, they'd check the barn first and might miss a drifter sleeping in the house. The building's interior was in worse shape than the barn, with holes in the floor where rot had eaten through the boards and walls that showed daylight through gaps in their construction. But it offered shelter from the wind that picked up after dark, turning cold enough to remind him that winter wasn't far off. He lay in his sleeping bag on the floor of what had once been the living room, his rifle within easy reach, and his mind refusing to settle into rest. Through the broken windows he could hear the horses moving in the barn, occasional snorts and the soft thunder of hooves on wooden floors. The sounds were oddly comforting, reminding him of his childhood when he'd spent summers at his grandfather's ranch, falling asleep to the same symphony of equine contentment. Back then, life had seemed simple and full of possibility. Back then, he'd believed that hard work and good intentions were enough to guarantee success. The war had taught him differently. Afghanistan had shown him that sometimes good men died for no reason, that innocence was no shield against violence, and that the world was far more complicated and cruel than anything his small-town upbringing had prepared him for. He'd come home changed in ways that made civilian life feel impossible to navigate. His wife had tried to understand, had given him 3 years to work through whatever was broken inside him. But eventually, she'd admitted defeat and filed for divorce. He couldn't blame her. Living with him had become like living with a ghost, present in body but absent in all the ways that mattered. A sound outside brought him fully alert, his hand finding the rifle before his conscious mind had processed what he'd heard. He moved to the window with the practiced silence of someone who'd learned that noise could kill you, peering out into the darkness where moonlight painted everything in shades of silver and shadow. At first he saw nothing unusual, then movement near the barn caught his eye, a pale shape that stood out against the darker structure. The albino colt had somehow gotten out and was standing in the yard, its white coat making it clearly visible despite the late hour. Jake cursed under his breath and pulled on his boots, grabbing a halter from his gear and heading outside. The last thing he needed was for the colt to wander off and either hurt itself or attract attention from anyone who might be watching the property. As he approached, the young horse turned to face him, and Jake could swear there was something almost mischievous in its expression, as if the colt had engineered this escape specifically to test whether Jake would come after it. "How did you get out?" Jake asked, knowing the animal couldn't answer but needing to voice his frustration. "The barn door was closed. I checked it twice." The colt nickered softly and took a few steps away, then stopped and looked back as if inviting Jake to follow. Against his better judgment, Jake did, trailing the young horse across the yard toward the edge of the property where the land dropped away into a small ravine. The colt stopped at the edge, looking down into the darkness, and when Jake joined it, he understood why. Below, barely visible in the moonlight, was another structure, a small cabin tucked into the hillside that he'd completely missed in his earlier exploration of the property. The colt started down the slope with the sure-footedness of an animal that had made this journey before, and Jake followed carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. The cabin door was unlocked, and when Jake pushed it open, he found himself in what appeared to be Thomas Merrick's private sanctuary. The single room was lined with photographs of horses, certificates of breeding and registration, journals that documented years of careful genetic planning. A desk held papers that Jake couldn't read in the darkness, and a bookshelf groaned under the weight of veterinary texts and breeding guides. Jake lit the oil lamp he found on the desk, and the cabin sprang into warm illumination. The albino colt had followed him inside and now stood in the center of the room as if it belonged there, as if it had brought Jake here deliberately to show him something important. On the desk, Jake found a letter with his name on it. Not Jake Thornton, but simply to whoever finds this place. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the paper and began to read Thomas Merrick's final words. The letter was dated the day before Thomas had died, written in a hand that suggested the writer had been either rushed or extremely distressed. "If you're reading this," it began, "then I'm probably dead, and you've discovered the horses I left behind. I don't know who you are or what circumstances brought you to this remote valley, but I'm trusting that you're someone who cares enough about animals to have looked past the abandoned appearance of my property to find the life I've hidden here." The letter went on to explain what Walter had already told Jake, but in greater detail and with a perspective that came from living through the events rather than merely observing them. Thomas described the threats he'd received, the escalating violence that had made him fear for his life, and the impossible choice he'd faced between saving himself or saving his horses. He'd chosen the horses, had sacrificed everything to give them a chance at survival, but he'd known it might not be enough. "The white colt is special," Thomas had written, "not just because of his coloring or his bloodlines, though both are exceptional. He's special because he represents everything I tried to build here, a perfect synthesis of intelligence, athleticism, and temperament. If he survives to maturity, if he's trained properly and given the chance to prove himself, he could change the way people think about horse breeding. But more than that, he deserves to live. They all do. These horses trusted me to care for them, and I've failed them by dying. Please, whoever you are, don't let my failure become their death sentence." Jake set the letter down and looked at the albino colt, who was watching him with those unsettling pale blue eyes. The weight of Thomas Merrick's words settled over Jake like a physical burden, one he hadn't asked for but now felt incapable of refusing. He'd come to this valley looking for nothing more than a place to spend a few nights before moving on, but the dead man's letter had transformed his accidental discovery into something that felt dangerously close to destiny. The albino colt stepped closer and nudged his hand with its soft muzzle, the gesture both demanding and trusting in equal measure. Jake spent the rest of the night in the cabin, reading through Thomas's journals by lamplight, while the colt dozed in the corner like a large dog keeping watch over its master. The journals revealed a man who had been brilliant and obsessive in equal measure, someone who had understood horse genetics at a level that most breeders never reached. Thomas had documented every mating, every birth, every characteristic that appeared in his foals with meticulous attention to detail. The albino colt's pedigree traced back through 5 generations of carefully selected animals, each chosen for specific traits that would combine in the perfect offspring. But the journals also revealed something darker. Thomas had known someone was threatening him, had documented incidents of sabotage and intimidation that had escalated over the final months of his life. Equipment had been damaged, fences cut, and one of his best stallions had been deliberately spooked into injuring itself badly enough that it had to be put down. Thomas had suspected the creditors were behind the attacks, trying to pressure him into selling the horses at a fraction of their value, but he'd had no proof that would satisfy law enforcement. The final entry in the last journal was dated 2 days before Thomas's death. "They've made their intentions clear," he'd written. "If I don't turn over the horses by the end of the week, they'll take them by force. I've made arrangements to hide the herd, and I've contacted Walter about caring for them until this situation resolves. If something happens to me, the horses are my legacy. They're proof that one man with a vision and the stubbornness to pursue it can create something lasting and beautiful. Please, God, let someone find them who understands what they represent." Jake closed the journal and looked around the cabin with new understanding. This wasn't just a workspace, it was a shrine to a dream that had cost a man his life. The photographs on the walls weren't random decorations, they were a family tree. Visual documentation of the bloodlines that had produced the white colt now sleeping peacefully in the corner. Every horse in those pictures had contributed something essential to the creation of this one extraordinary animal. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside, Jake made a decision that terrified him with its finality. He would stay, not just for a few days or weeks, but for as long as it took to see this through properly. The horses needed someone who could do more than simply keep them alive. They needed someone who could train them, prepare them for whatever future might be possible once the legal situation resolved itself. And the albino colt in particular needed someone who could help it develop the potential that Thomas had bred into its very bones. The practical obstacles to this decision were enormous. Jake had perhaps $3,000 to his name, barely enough to feed himself for a few months, let alone support a herd of horses. He had no legal claim to the property or the animals, which meant he was essentially squatting and risking criminal charges if the wrong people discovered his presence. And there was always the possibility that whoever had killed Thomas might come looking to finish what they'd started, eliminating any witnesses or obstacles to their plans for the horses. But Jake had faced worse odds in Afghanistan, had survived situations where death seemed inevitable and escape impossible. At least here he was, fighting for something that mattered, protecting lives that had value beyond the tactical considerations of military strategy. The albino colt stirred and opened its eyes, fixing Jake with that penetrating stare that seemed to see straight through every excuse and rationalization he might construct for leaving. When Walter arrived later that morning, Jake met him in the yard with news of his decision. The old man's face went through a complex series of emotions, starting with relief and cycling through concern, before settling on something that looked like gratitude mixed with guilt. "You don't know what you're taking on," Walter said, his voice heavy with warning. "These people who killed Thomas, they won't stop just because someone new is caring for the horses. If anything, having a witness around might make them more dangerous." "I know," Jake replied, though he wasn't entirely certain he did understand the full scope of the risk he was accepting. "But I can't walk away from this. Those horses in there, especially that white colt, they deserve better than to be sold off to whoever's willing to pay, no questions asked about what happens to them afterward." Walter nodded slowly, his weathered face creasing into something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so sad. "Thomas would have liked you. He was always saying that the right person would come along eventually, someone who'd see what he saw in these horses. I thought he was just being hopeful, but maybe he was right after all." They spent the morning working together, establishing routines and systems that would allow Jake to care for the horses efficiently. Walter showed him where Thomas had stored veterinary supplies, explained which horses had special dietary needs or medical conditions that required monitoring, and shared insights about individual personalities that could only come from years of close observation. The albino colt, Walter explained, was bold to the point of recklessness, constantly testing boundaries and looking for new experiences. It would need firm but fair handling to channel that energy productively. As they worked, Jake found himself thinking about the contrast between this life and the one he'd been living for the past 5 years. Drifting from place to place had given him a kind of freedom, but it was the freedom of having nothing to lose because he owned nothing worth keeping. This, caring for horses that depended on him completely, fighting to preserve a dead man's dream, felt like having a purpose again. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Around midday, Walter's phone rang, and Jake watched the old man's face go pale as he listened to whoever was on the other end. When Walter ended the call, his hands were shaking. "That was my daughter," Walter said, his voice barely steady. "She's been asking around town about my expenses, trying to understand why I've been spending so much money lately. Apparently word got out that I've been buying feed in unusual quantities, and someone connected it to this property. She says there are men asking questions at the feed store, wanting to know if anyone's been caring for Thomas Merrick's horses." Jake felt his combat instincts kick in, his mind automatically assessing threats and calculating response options. How long do we have before they figure out where the horses are? Could be hours, could be days. Walter's face had aged a decade in the span of that phone call. The feed store owner is a good man, won't volunteer information to strangers, but these people have ways of making folks talk, and not all of them involve asking nicely. The two men stood in silence for a moment, both understanding that the situation had just shifted from merely difficult to actively dangerous. The albino colt, as if sensing the tension, moved closer to Jake and pressed its head against his chest. The gesture was so trusting, so completely innocent of the danger surrounding it, that Jake felt something fierce and protective rise up in his chest. These animals had done nothing wrong. They didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of human greed and violence. "We need to move them," Jake said, the decision forming even as he spoke the words. "Find somewhere safe to hide them until we can figure out a more permanent solution." Walter shook his head sadly. "There's nowhere to move them to. Every property within 100 miles is either too exposed or owned by people who wouldn't risk getting involved. These men have long memories and longer reach. Anyone who helps us becomes a target themselves." Jake thought of the cabin hidden in the ravine, of Thomas Merrick's journals documenting years of careful planning. The man had been smart enough to create something extraordinary. Surely he'd been smart enough to plan for the possibility that his horses might need to disappear completely. What about Thomas? He must have had a contingency plan, some way to protect the horses if things went bad. Walter's expression shifted, hope flickering across his weathered features. There might be something. Thomas mentioned once that he had connections with a sanctuary up north, place that takes in horses that need protection from abuse or neglect. Said if anything ever happened to him, they'd agreed to take his herd, no questions asked, but I never got the details, never thought I'd need them. They returned to the cabin and searched through Thomas's papers with renewed urgency. Jake worked methodically through the desk while Walter examined the bookshelf, both looking for anything that might reference a sanctuary or provide contact information. The albino colt watched from the doorway, its pale blue eyes tracking their movements with unnerving intelligence. Time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously, each minute feeling both endless and too brief as they raced against an invisible clock. It was Jake who found it, tucked into a hollowed-out book on veterinary medicine, a business card for Mountain Haven Horse Sanctuary, along with a handwritten note from someone named Rebecca Chen. "Thomas, this is my personal promise to you. If you ever need a safe place for your horses, we'll take them. All of them. No paperwork, no questions, no judgment. Just send word and we'll arrange transport. Your friend always, Rebecca." Jake pulled out his phone and dialed the number on the card, his heart pounding as it rang once, twice, 3 times. A woman's voice answered on the 4th ring, professional but warm. "Mountain Haven Sanctuary, this is Rebecca speaking." "My name is Jake Thornton," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I'm calling about Thomas Merrick's horses. He's dead, and the animals are in danger. I found your card and your promise to help." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Jake could hear the sound of Rebecca's breathing as she processed his words. "Thomas is dead?" Her voice had gone soft with grief. "How?" "Officially, a truck accident. Unofficially, murder by the creditors who wanted his horses." Jake watched Walter's face as he spoke, saw the old man's expression confirm the truth of his words. Right now, those same people are closing in on the farm where the horses are hidden. We need to move them immediately, but we have no resources and no safe destination. Rebecca's voice sharpened with determination. "How many horses are we talking about?" 13 total, including a 6-month-old albino colt that Thomas bred specifically. Another pause, this one filled with the sound of papers rustling and computer keys clicking. "I can have transport there by tomorrow evening at the earliest." That's how long it takes to arrange for trailers and drivers willing to make the trip on short notice. Can you keep them safe until then? Jake looked around the cabin, at Thomas's life work documented in journals and photographs, at the evidence of a man who had sacrificed everything for animals he loved. Outside, the white Colt stood watching, its unusual appearance making it a beacon that would be impossible to hide if anyone came looking. 24 hours seemed like an eternity when measured against the threat of men who'd already proven they were willing to kill to get what they wanted. "We'll keep them safe," Jake said, making a promise he had no idea how to keep. "Just get here as fast as you can." After ending the call, Jake and Walter looked at each other with the grim understanding of men who'd just committed to a course of action that could get them both killed. The horses needed 24 hours of protection, which meant Jake and Walter needed to make this abandoned farm defensible against whatever force might come looking for the herd. It was a military problem, and Jake found his mind slipping back into the tactical thinking that had kept him alive in combat zones. The farm's layout offered some natural advantages. The barn sat in a depression that made it invisible from the main road, and there was only one practical approach for vehicles. They could set up early warning systems, position themselves to see anyone coming long before they arrived, and if necessary, make it clear that taking these horses would cost more than the creditors were willing to pay. "Walter, what kind of weapons do you have access to?" Jake asked, already knowing he'd need more than the hunting rifle currently secured to his saddle. The old man's eyes widened slightly. "You're talking about a shooting war over horses. I'm talking about making it clear that we're prepared to fight if necessary. Sometimes the threat of violence is enough to make people reconsider their plans." Jake moved to the window and studied the terrain, mapping lines of sight and calculating fields of fire with the automatic precision of his military training. "But I won't start something unless they force my hand." Walter left to retrieve whatever weapons he could gather from his own property, promising to return before nightfall with supplies and reinforcements if he could convince anyone to help. Jake spent the afternoon preparing the farm for what might come, his mind falling into the familiar patterns of defensive planning that had been drilled into him during his military service. He positioned himself at various points around the property, noting which locations offered the best visibility and cover, which approaches would be most difficult for vehicles to navigate, where he could make a stand if it came to that. The horses seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. They moved restlessly in the barn, their usual calm replaced by nervous energy that manifested in stamping hooves and anxious whinnies. Only the albino colt remained unaffected, continuing to follow Jake wherever he went with that same bold curiosity that seemed to define its personality. The young horse's fearlessness was both admirable and concerning. In combat, Jake had seen too many young soldiers with that same absence of appropriate caution, and too many of them hadn't lived long enough to develop the wisdom that came from understanding their own mortality. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Jake heard the sound of approaching vehicles, multiple engines moving slowly up the rough road that led to the farm. His heart rate increased, but his hands remained steady as he checked his rifle and moved to a position where he could observe without being easily seen. Walter's truck appeared first, and Jake felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. But behind Walter came two more vehicles, and Jake's relief evaporated when he recognized them as the kind of heavy-duty pickups favored by men who did rough work for rougher employers. Walter climbed out of his truck looking 10 years older than he had that morning, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that might have been shame. The other vehicles disgorged 6 men, all armed, all wearing expressions that suggested they were accustomed to getting what they wanted through intimidation. The largest of them, a man whose shoulders suggested either serious gym time or steroid use, stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd never been successfully challenged. "Walter Hayes," the big man said, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "We've been looking for you. Word is, you know where Thomas Merrick's horses are hidden, and we're here to collect what's owed to us. Jake stepped out of his concealment, his rifle held in a ready but not overtly threatening position. The property belongs to Thomas Merrick's estate. You have no legal right to be here or to take anything from it. The big man's eyes fixed on Jake with predatory interest. And who might you be? The new caretaker? Another bleeding heart who thinks horses matter more than money? I'm someone who understands property rights and the consequences of theft. Jake kept his voice level and calm, the tone he'd used with hostile locals in Afghanistan when trying to de-escalate situations before they turned violent. Those horses aren't yours to take, and this property isn't yours to trespass on. I suggest you leave before this becomes a legal matter you'd rather avoid. The big man laughed, a sound without humor. Legal? Thomas Merrick died owing our employer over $200,000. Those horses are collateral on that debt, which gives us every right to seize them. Now you can step aside peacefully, or we can move you aside forcefully. Your choice. Jake's finger moved closer to the trigger guard, not threatening yet, but making his position clear. The math doesn't work that way. Even if your claim had legal standing, which I doubt, the horses' combined value far exceeds the debt. Taking all of them would be theft, pure and simple. You'd be better served letting the courts handle this properly. One of the other men moved toward the barn, clearly planning to verify that the horses were actually inside. Jake shifted his aim fractionally, not pointing the rifle at anyone but making it clear that he was tracking the movement. I wouldn't do that if I were you. The first person who touches that barn door is going to have a very bad day. The tension in the yard ratcheted up several notches. The 6 men spread out slightly, their hands moving toward weapons that had previously been concealed. Walter stood frozen between the two groups, his face pale with the understanding that his attempt to bring help had instead brought the very threat they'd been trying to avoid. The big man's expression hardened into something cold and dangerous. You're outgunned and outnumbered, friend. Whatever noble intentions you've got here, they're not worth dying for. Step aside, let us take the horses, and you can walk away from this without any holes in you. Jake felt the familiar clarity that came with combat situations, time seeming to slow as his mind processed options and outcomes with mechanical efficiency. He could probably drop 2 of them before they could return effective fire, maybe 3 if he was lucky. But the odds of surviving a prolonged gunfight against 6 armed men were essentially 0. What he needed was a way to change the equation, to introduce an element these men hadn't planned for. As if summoned by his thoughts, the albino colt appeared in the barn doorway. Somehow the young horse had managed to work open the latch Jake had secured, and now it stood framed in the opening like a vision from a dream, its white coat catching the last rays of sunlight and seeming to glow with an inner radiance. The men in the yard fell silent, staring at the colt with expressions that ranged from shock to something approaching reverence. The big man's demeanor changed instantly. His aggression melted away, replaced by naked greed that was somehow more frightening than the threat of violence had been. That's it, he breathed, his eyes locked on the colt. That's the white one Thomas was breeding. Our employer will pay triple for that animal alone. Forget the others. We're taking that colt right now. He moved toward the barn with sudden speed, his hand reaching for the halter hanging from his belt. The albino colt, displaying none of its usual friendliness, reared back with a squeal of alarm that seemed far too large for such a young animal. Jake's finger found the trigger as he shouted a warning he knew wouldn't be heeded. Everything that happened next occurred in the space between one heartbeat and the next, violence erupting with the sudden inevitability of summer lightning. Jake's first shot went high, deliberately missing, but close enough that the big man felt the bullet pass. The crack of the rifle echoed across the valley like thunder, and for a frozen moment, everyone stood perfectly still, processing the fact that the situation had just crossed from threats into actual combat. Then chaos erupted as the 6 men scrambled for cover, drawing their own weapons and returning fire with the panicked inaccuracy of people who weren't accustomed to being shot at by someone who knew what he was doing. Jake moved with the fluid efficiency of his military training, using the terrain and structures for cover while maintaining fields of fire that kept the attackers pinned down. He wasn't trying to kill anyone, not yet, but he was making it abundantly clear that taking these horses would cost blood that their employer probably wasn't willing to pay. Another shot struck the ground inches from where the big man had taken cover behind his truck, and Jake heard the satisfying sound of someone cursing in fear. The albino colt had retreated into the barn at the first gunshot, and through the chaos, Jake could hear the other horses moving in panicked circles, their frightened whinnies cutting through the sounds of gunfire. He needed to end this quickly before the animals hurt themselves or before one of the attackers got lucky with a shot. Walter had taken cover behind his own truck and was shouting something that Jake couldn't make out over the noise. Then, cutting through the chaos like a knife through silk, came the sound of more vehicles approaching. Jake's heart sank, assuming reinforcements had arrived for the attackers. But what emerged from the dust cloud was a convoy of horse trailers led by a pickup truck with Mountain Haven Sanctuary painted on its side. Rebecca Chen had somehow cut the travel time in half, arriving a full 12 hours earlier than promised, and she'd brought enough people and vehicles to evacuate all 13 horses in a single trip. The gunfire stuttered to a stop as both sides tried to process this new development. Rebecca climbed out of her truck with the calm authority of someone who dealt with difficult situations before, surveying the scene with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her voice, when she spoke, carried across the yard with surprising force. "I've already called the county sheriff and the state police. They should be here in about 15 minutes. Now, anyone who wants to explain to law enforcement why they were engaged in an armed standoff over horses that legally belonged to Thomas Merrick's estate is welcome to stick around. Everyone else might want to consider leaving while you still can." The big man and his companions exchanged glances, calculating odds and considering consequences. Whatever authority their employer might wield in certain circles, it apparently didn't extend to openly defying law enforcement while armed and trespassing. One by one, they retreated to their vehicles, engines starting with angry growls as they beat a hasty retreat down the mountain road. Jake lowered his rifle and found his hands were shaking with adrenaline crash. He'd been in firefights before, had survived situations where death seemed certain, but this felt different. This time he'd been fighting not to survive, but to protect something precious, and the distinction mattered in ways he was only beginning to understand. Rebecca approached him with a slight smile. "You must be Jake Thornton. Thomas wrote about you in one of his letters." Jake stared at her in confusion. "He wrote about me? We never met. I only found this place yesterday." She pulled a folded envelope from her pocket, worn and creased as if it had been carried for a long time. "He wrote this about 6 months ago, right after the colt was born. Said he had a feeling that when the time came, the right person would find the horses. Someone who understood loss and redemption, someone who needed a second chance as much as the animals did. He described you perfectly, right down to being a veteran who'd forgotten how to stay in one place." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Thomas Merrick had somehow known, had predicted with eerie accuracy, that a drifter with military experience would stumble onto the farm and make the choice to stay and fight. It seemed impossible, yet here he stood with the man's horses safe and the white colt watching from the barn doorway, as if it had expected this outcome all along. The loading process took 3 hours, with Rebecca's team working efficiently to coax each horse into the trailers. The animals seemed to understand they were being rescued rather than stolen, and even the most nervous among them cooperated with minimal fuss. The albino colt was loaded last, and it balked at the trailer ramp until Jake walked up beside it. Then, as if that was all it had been waiting for, the young horse followed him into the trailer and stood calmly while Jake secured the lead rope. "You're coming with us," Rebecca said. It wasn't a question. Thomas left instructions that whoever took care of the horses should be offered a position at the sanctuary. We need a trainer who understands what these animals represent. Jake looked back at the farm where he'd spent less than 2 days, but which had somehow changed the entire trajectory of his life. He thought about the 5 years he'd spent drifting, trying to outrun memories and guilt, and the feeling that he'd lost his purpose when he'd left the military. He thought about the albino colt and its strange devotion, about Thomas Merrick's faith in a stranger he'd never met, about the way fighting to protect these horses had made him feel more alive than he'd felt since coming home from war. "I'll come," he said simply. "But the white colt, he's mine to train. That's non-negotiable." Rebecca's smile widened. "Thomas specified that in his will. The colt goes to whoever takes care of the herd. Looks like he already chose you anyway." As the convoy pulled away from the abandoned farm, Jake rode in the lead trailer with the albino colt, one hand resting on the young horse's neck. Through the window, he watched the sun setting over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere ahead lay a new life, a purpose he'd thought was lost forever, and a chance to help something extraordinary reach its full potential. The colt shifted its weight and pressed closer to Jake, a gesture of trust and affection that needed no translation. In that moment, Jake understood that he'd found what he'd been searching for all along without knowing what he sought. Not just a place to stay or a job to occupy his time, but something worth fighting for, worth staying for, worth building a future around. The white colt nickered softly, and Jake smiled, understanding at last why Thomas Merrick had sacrificed everything for these animals. Some things were simply worth more than survival. Some things were worth living for.